Hello and welcome to the Your Parenting Mojo podcast. This is part 2 of our deep dive into Dr. Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation. In part 1, we questioned whether there really is a teen mental health crisis as dramatic as Haidt describes. We saw how changes in diagnosis and coding and healthcare access might be inflating the numbers, as well as the study methodology of the studies that show this finding. We visited Palo Alto, California, where tight community bonds couldn't prevent crushing academic pressure from driving teen suicide rates to 4 to 5 times the national average. But let's just say that we accept that teen mental health challenges have increased to some extent, even if it's not as much as Haidt says that they have. The next question is, what is causing that increase in challenges? Haidt is adamant that social media is the culprit. In The Anxious Generation, he writes, quote, "Taken as a whole, the dozens of experiments that Jean Twenge, Zach Rausch, and I have collected confirm and extend the patterns found in the correlational studies. Social media use is a cause of anxiety, depression, and other ailments, not just a correlate," end quote. That's a bold claim. So today we're going to examine those dozens of experiments. We will look at what happens when you tell psychology students you are studying digital wellness and then ask them to track their social media use. We will explore natural experiments where entire regions get high-speed internet at different times. And we'll dig into the fierce debate between researchers who see catastrophe and those who see, well, not so much at all. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why one researcher compared the effect of social media on teen well-being to the effect of eating potatoes, and why that comparison matters more than you might think. So let's dive into those studies that Haidt references as showing a causal relationship between social media use and kids' well-being. At this point, I want to bring in Dr. Peter Gray's work. Yep, same Peter Gray, whom I interviewed way back in April 2018 for episode 62 on why we need to let our kids take more risks. Dr. Gray's Substack is the place where I initially found some of the critiques of Haidt's work, but I didn't really dig into it anymore until I started writing this episode. So Gray takes one of the papers that Haidt cites in The Anxious Generation as providing experimental support and shows why that might not be the right conclusion to draw from it. This is the paper by Melissa Hunt and colleagues called No More FOMO, Limiting Social Media Decreases Loneliness and Depression. In this paper, 143 psychology undergrads were randomly assigned to either limit Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat usage to no more than 10 minutes per platform per day, or to use social media as usual for a 3-week period. The students responded to questionnaires to tell the researchers about their well-being. The researchers verified the students' social media usage through screenshots from their devices. Gray says, quote, "The most damaging flaws with this study, which should be obvious to any social scientist, is there are no controls for demand effects or placebo effects," end quote. So the demand effect is one that shows up across many of the experiments that I read for this episode, and it happens when the participant knows or can guess the researcher's hypothesis and acts to confirm the hypothesis. The participants knew that they were supposed to track their social media use and report on their well-being. They will have been told many times by their parents, by teachers, by the media that social media usage is bad for you. So it seems hard to imagine the students couldn't figure out the purpose of the experiment. And there's a decent likelihood that this shaped their self-reported descriptions of their well-being. In addition to the issues that Dr. Gray notes, I will add here the participants were psychology students looking for course credit, so it seems likely they could figure out who was doing the research, even if it was done sort of anonymously, and what was its purpose, and they may even have wanted their professor to get a publishable result. They might not have wanted their professor, a figure in authority, to know that they were struggling with mental health issues, which could also have affected how they rated themselves in the study. Dr. Gray notes that there was no placebo in the study, which is like when a company designs a drug to reduce depression and gives some people a pill with the drug in it and some people a pill with no medicine in it to see if the pill with the medicine performs better than the one without. In this case, there's no way to create a placebo effect because you can't hide whether a participant is in the experimental or control group from the participants. Gray goes on to say, quote, "But now here's the kicker. Despite that possibility of demand and placebo effects, the researchers found very weak and inconsistent effects of the intervention on their measures of well-being. They found no significant overall effect on psychological well-being combining the measures. No effect on anxiety, no effect on self-esteem, no effect on autonomy, no effect on self-acceptance. They found only rather small effects on self-reported loneliness and depression, and the latter effect was only significant for those participants who showed higher than average depression at the beginning of the study. When you measure a lot of things without predicting beforehand which things will be affected and which will not, one or more of those things might come out by chance in a manner consistent with the initial hypothesis, especially when the effects are rather small. In my mind, it is at least as reasonable to attribute the reported findings in the study to chance, or to the placebo effect, or the demand effect, or to some combination of all of these, as it is to attribute them to the reduced use of social media." End quote. Other factors that Dr. Gray does not identify, but could very well have swayed the results, are that the participants self-reported their social media use and their psychological well-being. The social media use screenshots were supposed to be an objective measure, but it's possible that just being more aware of your social media usage, as well as your mood, could have affected the well-being of the students in either group. Students in both groups actually showed reductions in anxiety and fear of missing out, which suggests support for the benefits of self-monitoring. The experiment only lasted for 3 weeks, so who knows whether the temporary boost in well-being that was seen would persist over time, as we would want to know it does before creating state-level or national policies to regulate teen screen time use. Haidt described a study by Clemens and colleagues in The Anxious Generation like this. Another study randomly assigned teen girls to be exposed to selfies taken from Instagram, either in their original state or after modification by the experimenters to be extra attractive. Haidt goes on to quote directly from the study, "Results showed that exposure to manipulated Instagram photos directly led to lower body image." End quote. So that study had the same placebo and demand effects as Hunt's study. Even though the participants were told the researcher was about facial preferences, it's hard to imagine an adolescent girl would not have heard that perfect Instagram images are harmful to body image, which could have predisposed them to report lower body satisfaction after they saw the manipulated photos. Despite the cover story about facial preferences, the act of being asked to scrutinize Instagram selfies and then asking them to think about their body satisfaction could have primed them for negative self-reflection. In a similar way that we sometimes see when girls are asked to be aware of their gender, they may perform worse on a math test. Regarding the demand effect, the girls may well have guessed the study's hypothesis and then felt pressure to report negative feelings after seeing the manipulated images. The researchers knew which group study participants were in. The participants could probably have figured it out too if they noticed the obvious photo manipulation. The participants were asked to view 10 selfies in a row, which is not typical Instagram usage, and might exaggerate effects that wouldn't occur with casual real-world browsing. The sample was limited to Dutch adolescent girls of a similar ethnic background who were recruited using a snowball sampling method, which is a fancy term that means we asked people we knew and then we asked them to refer us to other people, which could have introduced selection bias into the results. Girls who were already interested in or affected by social media and body image issues might have signed up and then referred the researchers to their friends who are also affected by social media and body image issues. The study measured immediate short-term impacts, so we don't know anything about longer-term or cumulative impacts. It also used self-reported information about body image, which could have been affected by the participants' mood, context, perceived expectations, rather than long-term psychological changes or actual behavior in a real-world setting. The images were viewed alone, just as images, not in the context of the likes and the comments you get on Instagram, which might either buffer or exacerbate the effects. There was no control for the participants' baseline mood or body satisfaction, which again could have influenced the results. And this is just 2 of the hundreds of studies that Haidt cites to demonstrate that social media use causes anxiety and depression. He cites 2 studies specifically in support of this idea. The first is by Primack and colleagues, which does attempt to give us a longer-term perspective by taking a baseline and following up 6 months later. But it's limited by the same placebo and demand effect problems that we saw in the other studies, along with social media usage data being self-reported, which may not accurately reflect real usage. In addition, only 56% of the initial 2,408 respondents completed the follow-up, and the ones who remained were older, more likely to be female, which could have affected the results. The second study is by Shakya and Christakis, which was observational and longitudinal, which means participants were not randomly assigned to use or not use Facebook, and they weren't told how Facebook might affect their well-being, which goes partway to addressing the demand effect issue. But participants knew the researchers had access to their Facebook data, and they were being asked questions about their mental and physical health, which might have influenced their responses if they believe social media is supposed to be harmful. The study did not have a control, so there was no comparison group engaging in non-social media activity online, which makes it difficult to rule out effects from general screen use versus Facebook specifically. As usual, participants self-reported data on their physical and mental health and life satisfaction, which is vulnerable to the participant's mood at the time of reporting, problems with remembering what's happened over the last 6 months, and a desire to demonstrate, or not, a connection between mental health and Facebook use. People who felt guilty or conflicted about the time they spent on Facebook might have rated themselves more poorly, regardless of any true effect. The sample was drawn from a panel created by the research firm Gallup, who were willing to respond to repeated surveys and voluntarily allowed access to their Facebook data. The participants in this study were younger, more female, and more socially connected than the broader sample, which is likely not representative of all Facebook users, let alone all social media users, or your average teen who is using TikTok for hours a day. To be fair to the researchers, some have genuinely tried to address these methodological problems. Dr. Amy Orban's specification curve analysis is a sophisticated attempt to show how research choices affect outcomes. When she tests all plausible analytical pathways, she's essentially saying, look, I can make this data show whatever I want, depending on my choices, so let's see the full range of possible findings. We'll hear more about some specific findings of this analysis when we start discussing Dr. Jean Twangy's work. The problem isn't so much individual researchers doing bad work, although there is some of that. It's that we're trying to use imperfect tools to answer questions that might be impossible to answer definitively. And when those imperfect answers are used to justify major policy changes, we want to be especially cautious. The studies I've mentioned so far are the ones cited in The Anxious Generation as directly supportive of social media causing the tidal wave of mental illness. But Dr. Haidt also has the Google Docs where he collates information much more than he was able to fit into the book. One of these is called Social Media and Mental Health, and he and Zach Rausch and Jean Twangy gather relevant studies and put them in that document. There are 24 studies listed in section 3.1 of that document. Experiments Indicating Harm is the subtitle of that section. And just kind of as a side note here, some researchers wrote a blog post for the London School of Economics blog that was pretty critical of the book. And one of their points was how Haidt shows the research supporting his opinion in the main text and acknowledges the ones that don't support his position in the endnotes. At least in the Google Docs, the experiments not indicating harm are described right after the ones indicating harm. So I was able to find 16 of those experiments indicating harm. The remainder weren't publicly available and weren't available through my institution. So here's what I found in the 16 that I looked at. Pretty much all of them have exactly the same demand and placebo effect problems that we've already seen. Alcott and colleagues literally told participants they were studying the welfare effects of social media, and then they paid people $102 to deactivate Facebook. 80% of participants later said that deactivation was, quote, good for them. But is there any chance the participants knew what they were supposed to answer? As we saw earlier, it's very difficult to set up a good control condition where the participants don't know if they're in the treatment or the control group. If you're asking people to quit social media, they know that the study is about social media and that they're in the experimental group. Only the studies that Haidt cites by Dr. Julia Brylevskaya attempted to have proper control groups where some groups increased their physical activity instead of reducing their social media usage. When you ask someone to monitor any behavior closely, they often feel more purposeful and in control. A study by Schwartz found that both the group that quit Instagram and the control group that kept using it normally both improved on measures of depression and self-esteem, which the researchers admitted might just be because being in a study about social media usage made people more aware of their usage. A study by Faulhaber emailed a treatment group every day with a reminder to limit social media use to 30 minutes per day across their top 3 platforms to test the effect of self-monitoring their use. The treatment group were given no instructions about changing their social media use, but completed the same surveys about their mental health. Only the treatment group's well-being improved, but this is not really so much a test of self-monitoring. The treatment group got monitoring encouragement, yes, and a behavioral target of 30 minutes of usage, and external daily reminders. The treatment group was essentially told, limiting social media is good for you every morning, but the control group didn't receive this messaging. There was also no verification that people actually reduced their usage to 30 minutes. The researchers even acknowledged it's important to point out that whether participants limited their social media use to the prescribed 30 minutes is not the critical aspect of this experiment. The critical aspect is that participants were trying to limit their social media usage. Even though many participants may not have been able to reduce their social media use to exactly 30 minutes every day, the intervention was still effective, end quote. This is classic placebo effect. People felt good about trying to be healthier, whether or not they changed their behavior very much. Most of the researchers told participants they were doing something related to some aspect of digital wellness, which may tap into the cultural narrative about technology being bad for you. Participants might feel virtuous for cutting back, regardless of the actual effects. A study by Brown and Kuss observed that people using social media for coping, habit, and boredom. If you take away a coping mechanism without addressing the underlying stress, is that really helpful in the long term? A study by Terrell and colleagues recruited students by telling them it was a study about Facebook use behaviors. They only included people who already use Facebook at least 2 hours a day, scored high on a depression or anxiety screening, and were willing to limit their use. And then they told the intervention group to embrace a personal challenge to abstain from using Facebook for up to 1 week, 7 days. To do this, we ask that you log out of Facebook on your computer, cell phone, tablet, and any other devices, and that you consider uninstalling the app from your phone or tablet. If you find that you absolutely cannot make it the full 7 days, please complete survey 2 before you resume use of Facebook, end quote. So, the instructions make it pretty clear the study is about Facebook use, that the researchers thought the students' Facebook behavior might be excessive, and they might have trouble even making it to a week without accessing it, and that abstaining was framed as a personal challenge. Finding that participants who already experienced mental health challenges felt relief when they were given both permission and academic credit to take a break doesn't prove that social media causes their stress in the first place. The study title, Short Abstinence from Online Social Networking Sites Reduces Perceived Stress, Especially in Excessive Users, is not a lie, but I'm not really sure it belongs in the Experiments Indicating Harm section of Haidt's Google Doc. The same problems come up over and over again. A study by Tai and colleagues recruited people who were already experiencing emotional distress, told them the study was about social media use, and then found that those who reduced usage to 60 minutes per day reported better appearance esteem. The researchers themselves acknowledged that when people reduce social media time, they do other things instead, but they didn't measure or control for what those other activities were. If someone spends less time comparing themselves to filtered photos and more time moving their body or hanging out with friends in person, which change was it that actually helped their body image? The vast majority of these studies only look at very short-term outcomes. They might check in with participants a week or at most a month after their social media use reduction to see how they're doing. Again, the 2 studies by Julia Brylevskaya had the longest follow-ups, one of them 3 months, the other 6 months. But these studies had very narrow samples of mostly female German university students. They relied on students reporting their own social media use and well-being, and they didn't look at the types of social media use that people reduced. There are now several meta-analyses available that purport to show a link between children's social media usage and reduced mental health. But a meta-analysis is a way of statistically analyzing the results of a lot of different studies. And when the studies included in the meta-analysis have the kinds of problems we've reviewed, I wouldn't have any more confidence in the meta-analysis than I do in the individual studies. If the studies we're looking at find statistically significant results, which some of them do, then the meta-analysis is likely to find a statistically significant result. But that does not help us to overcome all of the other methodological issues we've seen. You might be asking at this point, well, why does it matter, right? Why does all this methodology stuff matter? Studies have limitations, so what? Well, here's why it matters for your family. When research is this flawed, we can't tell the difference between correlation and causation. And if we can't tell what's actually causing the problems our kids face, we might end up fighting the wrong battle. Imagine if doctors treated every fever by putting patients in ice baths without checking whether the fever was caused by infection, by heat exhaustion, by medication side effects. That's essentially what happens when we assume that screens are the problem without solid evidence of what's really behind the change that we're seeing. Given all of the methodological problems with the experimental studies, things like the demand effect, the lack of proper controls, the short timeframes, the fact that it's hard to get parental permission to experiment on children, you might wonder if there's any way to study this question more rigorously. That's where natural experiments come in. These are quasi-experimental studies that take advantage of real-world changes, like when broadband internet rolls out to different regions at different times. If social media really is driving mental health problems, we should see clear patterns as internet access improves. So let's see what these studies actually found. The assumption is that as broadband gets faster, kids want to use it more, and their mental health suffers as they're on social media more. I looked at all 3 studies on broadband rollout that Haidt cites, one each from England, from Spain, from Italy. The Spanish study couldn't isolate social media use from general internet use, but the researchers looked at the connection between the timing of negative mental health effects and the rise of Instagram and TikTok. There were some unfortunate issues with that Spanish study, including that a link between broadband rollout and depression and anxiety was found for men born between 1985 and 1995, but not women. Yet, the abstract at the beginning of the paper says, in particular, internet access leads to an increase in diagnoses of depression, anxiety, drug abuse, and personality disorders for both males and females, and of eating and sleep disorders for females only, end quote. This is not the first time I've seen one result discussed in a paper and another reported in the abstract, but it's disappointing to find it here. The time period the Italian study covers mostly predates widespread social media, and yet the research observed mental health effects there as well, which implies mental health impacts are not uniquely tied to social media, that they can come from other things people do online. They mention gambling, and perhaps we might add porn to that list as well. The English study was especially interesting because broadband improvement was done in neighborhoods at a time rather than entire cities. The average neighborhood has about 650 households, and the 6,000 children in the sample lived in 3,765 neighborhoods. This made the broadband rollout data quite fine-grained, and the health and wellness data was quite fine-grained as well because it's part of a much bigger study of over 40,000 households with 8 waves of data. Children in the house are given a questionnaire where they're asked about how they feel about their schoolwork, appearance, family, friends, school, and life as a whole. There are also questions about whether kids belong to social media site, and if so, how many hours a day they spend interacting with friends on social media, and what other activities they're involved in, which is vulnerable to the usual limitations on self-reported data. Strangely, the study found that broadband speed is strongly associated with better performance on exams at age 10 to 11, and then with worse performance on exams at age 16. The largest effect found from a 1% increase in broadband speed was the decrease in how children felt about their appearance by about 0.6% on average. There was no statistically significant relationship between the use of social media and girls' satisfaction with their friends or family relationships. Spending 5+ hours on social media use per day had a larger negative effect on well-being than other online activities, like watching TV and gaming. And for girls, the effect sizes were comparable to effect sizes from issues like bullying or family conflict found in other research. The researchers believe that time spent on social media use crowds out time spent on other activities, especially sports, since social media use was associated with taking part in fewer activities. Although this kind of assumes that a kid who is bouncing to a different sport or instrument or whatever every night is somehow doing better than one who focuses only on getting really good at one activity. Both the English and the Spanish researchers split their data by various factors like gender, age, urban and rural areas. Because they don't state up front that they're planning to do this analysis, especially when initial results aren't significant but become significant after the splitting, we start to worry that p-hacking is happening, which is when you go searching in your data for some sort of statistically significant finding. There's no direct evidence that this happened, but because the researchers don't say up front what analysis they were going to do, and then they go in to analyze several different subgroups of data and compare multiple variables without correcting for this increases the likelihood of false positive results. So once again, we're left wondering why the researchers didn't set up the study in a way that could actually tell us what we wanted to know, rather than seeming to back into it along the way. The final sets of data that I want to look at were a body of work arguing that screen time is harming our children, and then also one that argues that maybe our concerns are overblown. Dr. Jean Twenge's work was the obvious choice for me on the is harming side, since she collaborates with Jonathan Haidt so often, and he cites her work in The Anxious Generation. I came across Dr. Amy Orban's work several times as I was researching this episode, and she often comes to the opposite conclusion. I downloaded every paper I could find from each of their websites that was relevant to this topic, which was 20 from Dr. Twenge and 19 from Dr. Orban. Reading Dr. Twenge's studies, I can see why she would be alarmed. She looks at multiple large data sets, often of over 100,000 participants that are representative of the US population, and finds that teens who use a lot of digital media, especially social media, are twice as likely to report low well-being, depressive symptoms, and suicide risk factors compared to light users. She finds this pattern occurs in the UK as well, and is especially pronounced for girls. The relationship is not linear. Teens who use social media for up to an hour a day often have slightly higher well-being than teens who don't use it, but well-being declines steadily as you go beyond 1 to 2 hours per day. Most of Twenge's findings are correlational, which means she can say that screen time and well-being are linked, but can't prove that one causes the other. But she does cite longitudinal studies suggesting that more social media use can predict later declines in well-being, rather than a decline in well-being predicting social media use. She proposes that sleep disruption, displacement of in-person interactions and exercise, social comparison, and cyberbullying create the negative effects. Twenge's critics say that self-reported screen time is imprecise, and when you ask teens to keep track of their screen time as it's happening and ask them to look back over a week or a month, you tend to get very different pictures of their use, and which one is correct, we don't know. Twenge responds that both of these methods will yield similar associations with teens' well-being, especially for heavy social media use. She does consider gender differences and distinguishes between different types of screen use, which shows that not all screen time is equally problematic. This is really important because so many of the studies don't make this distinction, and different kinds of screen time do seem to affect boys and girls differently. Twenge believes that studies not finding an impact associated with screen time may be over-controlling by including mediators like parental distress that can hide associations with screen time that really are there. But her critics argue that even though she uses some demographic controls, confounds that she doesn't control for, like family environment and pre-existing mental health issues, could contribute to the results that she's finding. When we think about the size of the data sets we're looking at, we find ourselves at the intersection of Twenge and Orban's work. When you use huge data sets, you tend to be able to find relationships between all kinds of things that aren't very relevant. Orban actually criticizes Twenge's work by comparing the association between well-being and digital technology use to other everyday activities. And that's where she found the link between teens' well-being and their digital technology use had about the same correlation as the link between their well-being and whether they eat potatoes. Both correlations were statistically significant in a data set of more than 60,000 people, but we have to assume, as far as we know, there's no real relationship between well-being and eating potatoes. And this gives a concrete example of how researchers can fish for significant results by testing thousands of variable combinations in large data sets and produce some statistically significant correlations that end up being irrelevant in the real world. I'm reminded of a study that I once read on some kind of intervention to get babies to sleep more, which created a reduction of about 1/3 of a waking episode per night, from something like 10 wakings to 9.6 wakings. Statistically significant, yes, but does this have any relevance to the sleep-deprived parent's life? Not so much. So Orban points out that the same goes for the screen time data. Often the correlations Twenge finds explain less than 1% of the variance in well-being. The effects vary by gender, developmental stage, and the choices the researcher makes in analyzing the data. And even when they are there, the effects aren't always statistically significant. So let's spend a minute looking at those analytical choices. In any study, researchers make analytical decisions about which variables to control for, how to define concepts like well-being, which time frame to study, and each choice made impacts the results. We saw a lot of instances of this earlier where we talked about the experimental data, and each of those choices affects the study's outcomes. This is why I have a hard time when people criticize my bias, because I know I'm biased, and I tell you what my biases are. But the idea that scientific research is somehow not biased is really mistaken. It's just that the bias is so baked into the studies that we can't see it as easily. So Dr. Orban uses this technique called specification curve analysis, which is a way to evaluate how the choices a researcher makes affect the study outcomes. And this is a method that researchers use to test many reasonable ways of analyzing the same data. It helps to show whether the main result is consistent across different choices the researcher might make, or if it only appears under specific conditions and certain choices. Orban's work showed that some published results on screen time, including Twenge's, are among the most negative possible and are not representative of the full range of plausible outcomes. This means that you could reasonably look at the same data that Twenge did and make different analytical choices and reach very different conclusions than Twenge does. Orban also argues that many studies conflate between-person associations, which means comparing different people at one time, with within-person effects, which means how changes in one person's behavior affect their own well-being over time. She finds that longitudinal analyses show that within-person effects are even smaller than cross-sectional ones. And this is pretty important if we're thinking about banning screen time, where we expect to see a change in a single person's well-being after removing access to screen time. I am feeling pretty frustrated about the state of the research base at this point. I actually can imagine an entire research program that would address the shortcomings in each of the kinds of studies we've reviewed, and even include studies designed by teens to help us finally answer once and for all the extent to which screen time affects children's health. I actually did go ahead and imagine that entire program of research, and I described it all for you, and then I realized you actually wouldn't want to listen to that for the 10 minutes it would take me to describe it. Because at the end of the day, the anxious generation is using words like the surge of suffering and the tidal wave of anxiety and depression and the mental health crisis to describe a very impressive looking set of hockey stick graphs that explains less than 1% of the variance in children's well-being. Twenge's rebuttal is that we would have to dismiss things like the link between smoking and lung cancer if we use that same 1% variance standard to dismiss other risk factors. Twenge and Orban essentially kind of talk past each other on this topic. Twenge says we'll stop dismissing meaningful associations based on variance explained, and Orban says, well, let's use more sophisticated methods to understand the true relationships. But whether we perceive that 1% as meaningful or not, we can't deny there's another 99% of the variance to explain. Here's what the research says are just some of the factors that are bigger contributors than screen time usage. The first is family relationships. One of the studies that we looked at earlier from the UK found that 64% of 11 to 15-year-olds cited family relationships as their primary problem contributing to their self-harm. There's a significant association between positive support relationships with parents and young people's well-being and life satisfactions. The next is social connections and relationships. This isn't just about having friends, but the quality of those friendships. Strong friendships can be especially protective when the child is not getting support from their family. But face-to-face time with friends was declining long before smartphones existed, which suggests much broader social changes at work. The third is economic security. Stress of poverty is terrifying in the US particularly. Financial instability affects everything from where families live to whether parents are home or working multiple jobs to whether there's food on the table. Those without families, youth of color, homeless youth, asylum seekers, refugees, trans youth are especially precarious and vulnerable. Having money can be protective for the people who have it, but not having money can be incredibly difficult for those who don't. The fourth factor is sleep and physical health. So poor sleep is both a cause and effect of mental health struggles. Academic pressure, extracurricular activities, and yes, screen time can all interfere with sleep. So can anxiety about grades, family stress, or unsafe neighborhoods. Fifth factor is academic pressure. 48 of 52 studies in one meta-analysis found evidence of a positive association between academic pressure or timing within the school year and at least one mental health outcome. Palo Alto students' emergency room visits peaked during the school year and dropped during the summer, indicating that pressure from school was a contributor to the teens' mental health there. The sixth issue is the school environment. Beyond academic pressure, factors like bullying, feeling unsafe, lack of belonging, and unsupportive teachers all contribute to mental health challenges. We've seen recent increases in the percentage of students who were threatened or injured with a weapon at school, and in the percentage of students who were bullied at school, up 15% to 19%. There's also been a jump in the percentage of students who miss school because of safety concerns, either at school or on the way to school. When we focus exclusively on that 1% of teens' well-being that's attributed to social media, we're ignoring the complex web of factors that actually shapes their mental health. This brings us back to Dr. Twangy's work that we opened up with in our last episode, where she looked at 13 factors that could have caused the mental health crisis, as she describes it, and then debunks each of them as an inadequate single explainer of mental health outcomes. But when we live in a society this complex, is it more likely that something as complex as an increase in mental health challenges is caused by one single factor, and that factor is screen time, or by a whole host of factors working together? Haidt's strongest argument on this point is timing. Why would there be an inflection point around 2012? But consider what else was happening globally. The 2008 financial crisis was still rippling through families worldwide. Climate change was becoming an unavoidable reality for young people. Mental health awareness was increasing, reducing stigma around seeking help. Different countries had their own pressures, austerity in the UK and parts of Europe, educational reforms like Common Core in the US, and testing-focused changes in other countries. Maybe teens turn to social media more when they're stressed about climate change, or when their families are struggling financially, or when school feels pointless and disconnected from their real interests. In that case, the phone isn't the root cause. It's how kids are coping with a world that feels increasingly overwhelming and out of their control. And we might find that taking away one of their main coping mechanisms without replacing it with a more effective coping mechanism, or addressing the problem at its root, makes things worse rather than better. Twangy says we should still focus on screen time because even though the variance is small on an individual level, at the population level the effects are large, and even small shifts in population well-being have profound societal costs. Orban would respond to this by saying that for most people, the risk posed by digital technology use is negligible, and that focusing on extreme group differences, like the people who are harmed the most, can exaggerate the practical importance of the effect. The effects on groups of kids are nuanced. The effects on each individual child are nuanced. One teen may find social media use helpful at one point in the day and not helpful at another point in the day. And as far as I can see, up to this point, Twangy has not taken a strong policy position. For example, in one paper, she suggested limiting screen usage to 1 to 2 hours per day, and that high levels of social media and internet use should be an indicator of a more careful screening for mental health issues. But she has a brand new book that will be published in September 2025 called 10 Rules for Raising Kids in a High-Tech World that is rather less nuanced and rather more prescriptive. Rule number 1 is you're in charge. There's also no social media use until 16 or later, and give this first smartphone with the driver's license. These recommendations are not nuanced or specific. Again, Twangy is arguing for change on the issue because it's doable, right? We can do these things in our families, but creating a supportive family relationship is also doable and would potentially have a much larger impact on children's mental health. I want to find and pull the biggest levers we can to support kids. I'll never forget what was a bombshell moment for me at the time when I interviewed Dr. Ainsley Gilpin on what children learn from pretend play. At the end of the interview, she just kind of casually dropped the idea that she knows the effect sizes in her research are tiny, but the interventions are cheap, so they keep doing the research because people want to do the interventions because they don't cost a lot. In this case, it isn't so much the interventions are cheap, but it seems to be politically popular for families and schools and politicians to come together to criticize the big tech companies. And don't get me wrong, I think there's a lot wrong with our culture when producing a product that companies know causes harm to some people is seen as a perfectly viable business decision. But that's the culture we live in. That's how we got climate change. That's how we got cars sold with known faults because the company balances the cost of the lawsuits they'll get when people die with the cost of the recall, and they pick whichever number is lower. A commenter on one of Dr. Haidt's Google Docs says that, quote, "You argue that the effect size of the marginal hour of social media is larger than others found, and I like your argument. I agree, but I'm concerned that those who are on the other side of the argument are missing this. Social media is not the disease. It's the vehicle for the disease. It's the grimy subway railing you touch that has 1,000 pathogens. Measuring the effect size of touching the railing for an additional marginal minute is not measuring the right thing," end quote. The pathogens are the ideas that kids are getting through social media, and the commenter calls some ideas pathogens that I don't think necessarily are, which is a result of us having different outlooks on the world. We've been told over and over again that screens are terrible for children. Social media is terrible for children. It's come to be something we almost intuitively believe, like cold weather causes you to catch a cold, even though it kind of doesn't. But what if it isn't social media that's so terrible, but the ideas they're getting exposed to through social media? Those are not going to change. And teens are likely to be exposed to them through other channels if we cut off their social media use. What if, when teens aren't distracted by social media anymore, they throw themselves into their schoolwork and we end up pressuring them into another Palo Alto type of situation like we saw in part 1 in this series? What if the kids just exert the same cultural forces on each other in the playground that they would otherwise get on social media? Dr. Orban notes the Sisyphean cycle of technology panics. This is not the first time we've worried that teens' behavior is affected by the media. In the 1940s, radio dramas were blamed for making children anxious. In the 50s, comic books were thought to cause juvenile delinquency. In the 80s, TV viewing was blamed for violence and aggression, and in the 2000s, video games were linked to criminal behavior. Orban says the cycle has 4 stages. So new technology plus societal concerns create a moral panic. And then research is done to address public fears, and the researchers start from scratch because they lack theoretical frameworks. The research ends up happening too slowly. A new technology emerges, and the cycle restarts as society moves on to worrying about the next technology before we've fully understood the last one. We can see the AI panic coming already. And this matters because it shows how we're already moving on to the next technology panic before we've even figured out the last one. Just as we're debating social media and phone bans, schools are now grappling with ChatGPT, and parents are worried about AI companions and deepfakes. The pattern that Orban identified, the moral panic, the rushed research, the lack of theoretical frameworks, and then moving on to the next fear, means we never actually learn how to help kids navigate technology thoughtfully. We're so busy fighting the last war, we don't develop sustainable approaches to digital literacy and well-being. If we ban social media today, what happens when the next technology arrives? Do we ban that too? And in all of this, we're primarily looking at the global north. Despite over 80% of the world's population living in the global south, over 70% of studies on adolescent depression and social media recruited participants only from the global north, because we're the ones having the moral panics. We're the ones who can relate to the slim blonde-haired white girl staring at her phone on the Anxious Generation book's cover and worry that it represents our own child's future. This is going to be one of those episodes that I never want to publish because there's always more information I can add to it. At the end of May 2025, Haidt and his research assistant, Zach Rausch, posted on their After Babel blog, which is a Substack, about a, quote, major new study that was just posted online. by a group of researchers who set out to discover just how much consensus there actually is within the academic community on the potential harms of social media for adolescents and on the state of the evidence about those harms, although the study has not yet been peer-reviewed. I'm going to quote the next section at length. To structure the study, the researchers selected 26 claims from the text of The Anxious Generation, primarily from chapters 1, 5, and 6. We, meaning Haidt and Rausch, worked with them on this phase to refine the claims they propose in order to be confident that the claims to be tested were the claims we made. We were not otherwise involved in the genesis of the study nor in its design. The study leaders assembled a large panel of experts through targeted outreach to prominent researchers representing a range of perspectives on the issue. They then used snowball sampling, asking initial invitees to recommend additional experts. This process yielded a group of 229 researchers who were formally invited to participate in the study. Additional researchers gained access to the survey via posts in relevant academic forums, bringing the total number of individuals who received the survey at some point to 288. In phase 1, the study leaders distributed survey number 1 to the recruited experts and also posted it on relevant academic forums. The study asked participants to evaluate each of the 26 claims. A total of 137 experts evaluated at least one claim. For each claim, they were asked whether they believed it was probably true, don't know, or probably false. They were also asked whether empirical evidence supported or contradicted the claim, and what types of evidence, if any, were available. End quote. So then in phase 2 of the study, the responses from phase 1 were synthesized into 26 draft consensus statements that the same researchers rated for accuracy. So if we rephrase all of that, we could say 4 researchers, 2 of whom have published about or are investigating the harms of social media and the effects of reducing its use, 3 of whom work at the same New York University where Haidt and Rausch work, decided to recruit a set of experts. I made an initial run at trying to understand how diverse this group of experts really was. I couldn't look at the publication histories of all 121 of the ones who were actually cited as authors of the study, but even the researchers who wrote the report admit that it's possible that their sample is biased. In a blog post explaining how the study came about, the lead authors said that they invited potential participants to join a, quote, team to write a consensus statement on the causal impact of social media and mental health, and said that, as part of our methodology, we plan to select the central claims from the anxious generation and conduct a survey among experts to evaluate the extent of experimental evidence supporting each claim and identify key areas for future research, end quote. It's not super surprising that Dr. Orban, her regular collaborator, Dr. Andrew Shabilsky, and Dr. Candace Odgers, who wrote a critical review of The Anxious Generation in the prestigious journal Nature, all declined to participate. Dr. Chris Ferguson, who we called out in the last episode, who was the one who said that Haidt would have been failed if he had turned in this data as a senior research project, started participating, but then he dropped out of the study and posted on X, quote, I did the original survey, but my comments were ignored. Many others not invited, and some declined to participate because they viewed the organizers as having conflicts of interest, which they do. Result is a self-selecting biased sample, end quote. So 3 of the leading researchers who are critical of Haidt's claims dropped out before the project even started. They were invited and they didn't participate. Another one after the first round. But the lead researchers didn't seem to pause and wonder if the project should have been set up in a more inclusive way. Once the lead researchers had identified their participants, they then told the participants they were investigating a series of claims from The Anxious Generation, a popular recent book that is very critical of screen time, to see the extent to which the participants agree with the premises in the book. Because this is a book about the harms of social media, all the statements the researchers were asked to evaluate were written in the negative, so things like social deprivation can reduce mental health. Social media can impair sleep. So first, let's look at the conditional phrasing of those statements. Those cans are critical because they allow for so much flexibility in interpretation. Even with all of the issues in the research that we've considered in these last 2 episodes, I would probably agree that social deprivation can reduce mental health. It can impair sleep. Does it reduce mental health and impair sleep? And is it the most important factor affecting those outcomes? Maybe not, but it can affect them. So now I both believe the research on this topic is overblown, and I'm agreeing with the statement of harm. And then there's the fact that these topics are phrased as statements, not as questions. And you don't have to have 121 PhDs to know that people are much more likely to agree with questions when they're asked for a yes-no response, regardless of the content of the questions themselves. Participants will even agree with statements that logically contradict each other and can be swayed by the wording of a question. One study on this topic found that asking participants to agree or disagree with a statement inflates correlation between the items due to response style rather than actual opinion. So 110 of the researchers in this study said it is probably true that sleep deprivation can reduce mental health. What a shock! I could say, hey, I'm working with one of the world's leading researchers on how much hemorrhoids are painful, who's just published a book about how much hemorrhoids are painful that's getting a ton of publicity. Can you please say whether this statement is probably true or probably false? Hemorrhoids can be painful. Is it likely this methodology is going to introduce some bias into the results? In phase 2 of this experiment, the experts provided citations of relevant research, and the experts generally reported being aware of more evidence in favor of a claim than against. Well, I'm aware of more evidence in favor of these claims than against them, but that doesn't mean I agree with it for all of the reasons we've discussed in these episodes. Then they had the experts rate the policy statements in the anxious generation. That phone-free schools would benefit teens' mental health, that phone-free schools would benefit the mental health of adolescents overall, and that imposing and enforcing a legal minimum age for opening social media accounts would benefit the mental health of adolescents overall. This time, all the proposals are phrased in the positive. The experts thought all 3 proposals were probably true by a ratio of 8-1 on phone-free schools, 6-1 on no smartphones before high schools, and 3-1 on limiting social media use to over 16s. Although 20 to 25% of respondents said they didn't know if each of the policies would be more likely to provide benefits than not provide benefits. By separating out those don't knows and then reporting the benefit-no benefit ratio, it sounds to me like there's much more support from the benefit side than there really is. A ratio of 8-1 only means that about 70% of the experts thought phone-free schools would likely benefit mental health. A ratio of 3-1 means about 55% of them thought limiting social media to age 16 would improve mental health. Which is kind of a strange finding if you think about it, because aren't teens using their phones in school mostly on social media? So experts think social media causes harm. How can more of them think that keeping kids off social media during school hours is more likely to benefit them than limiting them entirely until they're 16? The blog post says that, quote, objections to the study largely centered on who was at the table rather than what emerged from it. Even if our invitees had skewed one way or the other, that imbalance would only matter if it generated flawed judgments. Ultimately, the central question is whether any substantive errors exist in our 26 consensus statements. If any expert uncovers a genuine error or oversight, we stand ready to make any necessary corrections during the review process, end quote. But there can't really be any genuine error or oversight because the results consist of the opinions of the participant experts. We can't know if the imbalance of participants generated flawed judgments because we had an imbalance of participants. So let me be clear what I'm trying to say here. The mental health challenges that teens face are real, but they are not distributed equally. We're pouring resources into debating whether suburban kids spend too much time on Instagram, while American Indian and Alaska Native girls are dying by suicide at 5 times the rate of white girls. 84% of Native girls experience violence in their lifetimes. These are not problems that smartphone bans would solve. In fact, for Native teens in geographically isolated communities, social media might be one of the few ways to connect with other Native youth, access mental health resources, or maintain cultural connections. For LGBTQ+ youth, the benefits of social media are well documented. It can act as a safe environment to access information about identity, express identity, or provide support among LGBTQ+ people, thus supporting mental health and well-being. Black teens are more likely than Hispanic and white teens to use social media to get information about mental health. When we ban all kids from using social media, we also ban the kids for whom social media is a lifeline, because their families and local communities don't accept them as they are. And this would only address girls' mental health use, because boys don't use social media as heavily and still commit suicide at such high rates that it's their deaths that drive the national level trends, not girls' deaths. The solutions we're discussing, banning social media, limiting screen time, are solutions designed by and for relatively privileged communities. They assume that the biggest threat to teen well-being is too much TikTok, not poverty, not discrimination, not academic pressure, not a lack of mental health services. And are we kidding ourselves that banning these services would actually mean that kids wouldn't be able to access them? Kids have been finding ways to get things we've banned for as long as we've been banning them. But they might be less likely to come to us for help if they know our first response will be, "But you shouldn't have been using it in the first place." I think there's a massive potential for action in between blanket bans and just holding up our hands and saying, "Fine, kids, do whatever you want." It's an approach that requires a lot more nuance than a blanket ban. It's going to require actually talking with our kids. It's going to require perceiving our kids as people with agency who shape their own technology use and who aren't just acted upon by big companies. And it might even address those factors that make up the other 99% of teen well-being. In part 3 of this mini-series, we will explore what a nuanced approach might look like. We'll discuss how to help teens develop their own internal compass for social media use, not through restriction, but through reflection and collaboration. We'll look at how parents can have productive conversations about online experiences without becoming the screen time police. And we'll examine what schools can do beyond banning phones to actually support teen well-being. Because if we really want to help our kids thrive, we need to look beyond their screens to their whole lives, their relationships, their stress levels, their sense of purpose and belonging. The solution is not as simple as taking away Instagram, but it might be more effective.